everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Today, we are not looking at the Fuso, in case you recognize what that is. We are going to talk a bit more about armor on ships and how it matters in the game. Now, I've done a video about Citadels quite a while ago, and I had some theories there, and some of them were right, and some of them were absolutely wrong. So I figured now is a good time to actually catch up on that and give it a bit of an update and explain what my current theories are towards the game, how the game mechanics are working, and all these kind of things. So let's get into it. Why are we looking at the Fuso? Well, I just needed something that has armor as an example. Battleships, and pretty much all other ships in the game, have multiple armor zones. Now there are a couple of armor zones that I'm reasonably certain that they exist, and there are a couple that I'm not so certain, but let's go through them. So, as I've said previously, and I'm just going to repeat it here, the Citadel. What is a Citadel in a ship? Well, the idea was at some point that historically all ships had armor all around, and it was kind of even. The problem was the more power, the more impacting power a shell has, especially once armor penetrating shells were introduced, the more armor you needed to stick on things. And armor is heavy. And it increases the displacement, and it makes all things more difficult, and it is difficult to manufacture and all those kind of things. So not having armor everywhere on the ship at some point became a design requirement, which meant that the designers said, well, okay, we're going to put the armor, as much as we can, we put the armor around the important bits and put, well, less armor around the not so important bits. And the important bits in a battleship or in any other kind of ship are the things that react very poorly to having explosions near them. Things like the powder magazines or the engine rooms. I mean, I'm not saying that something like the kitchen or the sleeping quarters react particularly well to having things explode in them, but it's a lot less dramatic. So the idea was we build a core ship of sorts, which is basically brick-shaped, and put all the armor around that, and put all the important bits in there, and the rest is more or less for decoration, or, well, to make it actually seaworthy, but that's the idea. So if we're looking at a ship, like in this case, the Fuso, the Citadel is most likely going to span from the foreturret, from the first turret in front, all the way to the last turret aft. And the reason for that is that often ammunition storage is, well, close to where the gun turrets are, because that's where the ammunition needs to go, and so is powder storage. Also, the engine room is underneath the smokestack, because that's what the smokestack does. It, well, removes smoke that the engine produces, so the engine room has to be there. So we know that the engine room is dead center, and we know that ammunition storage and other things are most likely within the barbettes or under or very close to where the gun turrets are. Now, how about the bits that aren't protected there? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But these parts have the heaviest armor, and on the side we're talking about belt armor. So that's our first armor module. How do we know that this actually exists? Well, in one of the update notes we got a bit of a hint. That was a while ago, but in this particular update note, the Ibuki, the Japanese Tier 9 cruiser, had her belt armor increased from 127mm to 140mm. This bit of information gives us two things. First of all, there is such a thing as belt armor, which implies that there is a part that is not belt armor. And we know that it is measured exactly in millimeters. So it wasn't increased from, say, medium to high, but it was increased from a very precise number to another very precise number. So armor modules exist, and their thickness matters. So we talked about belt armor. Belt armor obviously being on the side of the ship. And this is traditionally about the thickest armor that ships have. And in front and in the rear, fore and in the rear, in front of the belt armor and behind the belt armor, you will not find very much armor at all. Because again, ships get shot there, it isn't that bad. So we have belt armor, but that only protects the Citadel on the side. What about front and rear? Well, first of all, there's a bit of ship to go through, but still, there's the concept of transverse bulkheads. These are basically big steel parts that are providing the armor protection just before the first turret and just after the last turret, and probably a couple of one in the middle. But these are basically the other sides of the box. So think of a ship as a box, and this box goes from first to last turret and has sides and front and rear armor, which is relatively thick. Now, there's another direction where things can come from, and that's the top. Historically, ships often have more than one armored deck. The idea being that you have to deal with armor-piercing shells. And armor-piercing shells need to go through a certain amount of material before their fuses activate. And that's when multiple deck armors come in, because if the first one manages to actually get to trigger the fuse and get the shell to explode, but there's still another armor underneath, having this kind of spaced armor scheme is relatively helpful. Now, the deck armor usually is not as thick as the belt armor, at least on things like battleships. Just because, look at it. There's a lot of it. Ships are broad, and you would have to put it everywhere. Still, it's going to be thicker across the Citadel area than it is, again, outside the Citadel area. The last module that I'm relatively certain about, besides belt, deck, fore and aft armor schemes, is the superstructure. So if you look at the ship from the side, all these towers here, gun directors and the bridge and all those towers, and the funnel and whatever goes around it counts as superstructure. That stuff usually isn't as heavily armored as the rest either. The turrets, I assume, are counting as armor, as separate armor modules, but I am not 100% sure about that one. You often hear me say things like, oh, I thought I would be able to penetrate this. I must have bounced off the turret, because turrets traditionally are very, very heavily armored, especially the front of the turret, because that's when, battleships get shot from that direction. And the turret front is relatively heavily armored. It's a bit like a tank. It's like having a tank sitting on your deck. And the front of it is more heavily armored than the sides, because that's where it expects to be shot at from. So why does any of this matter? I mean, isn't it just like, shoot and then everything is random? No, I don't think so. Let's have a look at, a potential formula that I'm thinking of on how this works. So when you fire your guns, you come up with, there's some form of potential penetration that when the shell hits the target has to be calculated, right? So it depends on the gun type, obviously. Are we talking a small caliber, a large caliber? Are we talking a 200 millimeter? What kind of nation are we talking? How heavy is the shell? How fast is the shell? What kind of ammo type are we firing? Armor piercing has higher penetration than high explosive. How long has the shell been flying? Because we do know that the longer the shell flies, the lower its penetration is. And there's probably some form of random factor in there as well, to some degree. So this gives us a potential penetration at the point of impact. And this is where the armor becomes interesting. Because let's say for an armor piercing, the game now has to calculate, say you have a potential penetration of, let's say, 100 millimeters at this point of impact. Have you bounced off the armor, so your penetration was too low that it wouldn't even get anywhere? Have you had a semi-pen, which means you have penetrated something, but it has exploded without fully getting into the ship? Do we have a full penetration, where it has overpowered the armor? The shell has traveled to the inside of the ship and has exploded there? Or do we have an over-penetration, where the penetration potential is so much higher than the actual armor on impact that it went straight through and out the other side again without actually exploding? So while you do have a hole in the ship, nothing has exploded on the inside of the ship, which is generally considered rather useful. So this needs to be calculated, and this is where I think it matters where the armor, I have proof for that, but where it matters where you hit the ship. So, for example, let's say you have a battleship here, and you have, I'll have to look up how much the actual belt armor is, but let's say you have, 250 millimeters of belt armor on the fuso. I'll look that up and put it in post. Now you're shooting at this thing with 150mm armor piercing, let's say from a Nürnberg, at a range of about 6 kilometers. And you're hitting the belt armor. What are you going to get? Well, at best you're going to get a semi-penetration. Most likely you're going to get a couple of bounces which make no damage at all, because the penetration of these 150mm shells is not going to be enough to reliably penetrate this much belt armor, even at this close range. Which, as a quick aside, gets us to another point that where I was actually quite wrong before, which is the angle. In the PC version, the actual effective armor thickness comes from the angle where you hit the armor. So the more you're angled, obviously, geometrically, the more metal you have to get through as a shell before you get into the inside of the ship. Whereas if you're hitting a flat side of a ship, it has less metal to get through, so you get more penetration that way. Which also means broadsiding in the PC version is a lot less forgiving than on Blitz, because on Blitz the armor angles do not matter. And this was apparently confirmed by Wargaming a long time ago, that this is a mechanic that they have not introduced. So purely for penetration purposes, it doesn't matter if you're giving broadside or not. Now, only for penetration purposes, you still, when you're giving broadside, have a hell of a lot more of ship pointing or presenting the enemy to shoot at than if you are, if you're, say, bow in, because then it's a lot less ship for the enemy to actually hit, and shells that splash in the water don't do any damage whatsoever. But back to the point. So with the Nürnberg, now you're trying to shoot at this thing and you're not getting through, and you could say, okay, you should have been shooting high explosive. Yes, you could. Or you could try to hit some of the bits which have not that much armor, like the bow or the stern. And even though you're not going to score a Citadel hits, because the Citadel is not there, that's outside the Citadel area, but you are much more likely, with a relatively lower caliber, like cruiser caliber gun, to do full penetrations on the bow and stern of a battleship than you are on the belt armor. You could also try to shoot at the superstructure. That is surprisingly difficult, because unless you are like a kilometer away, it's relatively difficult to reliably target that area, just because there isn't that much of it. Now, the other thing that is really interesting, if let's say you're in another battleship, and again, you could try to punch through the belt armor, and it depends if the belt armor, like if you're shooting at a cruiser, the belt armor is relatively weak. The cruiser, like we've just talked about the Buki, and the Buki now has 140mm of belt armor. So if your shells can punch through 140mm of belt armor, then you can get citadels very nicely, which is what we want. Alternatively, if you shoot from a long range, your shells are more likely to hit the deck. And that's when the armored deck module becomes in play. And then it again depends on how much armor you have. It also depends on what kind of shell. And it probably depends a bit what angle. And now I'm not saying that the angle of the armor makes any sense or any difference, but probably if you have a shell with a very high arc, which is probably a better word, with a very high arc that comes in straight from the top, your chances of, I know you see that, your chances of getting through the deck armor are much better than if it comes in a relatively flat angle or flat arc, where your chances, if you're like this, your chances of hitting the deck armor are reduced because you might hit the belt armor and then bounce off. So that's where all these kind of things come from. So if you're shooting with a battleship at another battleship, it is often more beneficial, at least in Blitz, to aim higher. Basically to try to get through the deck armor, because again, armor angles don't matter. So if the deck armor has less armor in terms of citadel protection, you're more likely to do full penetrations in citadels if you get through there, rather than if you're trying to punch through the main belt, which is about the most heavily armored part of a ship. So all these things matter. Let's take a look at that a little bit in practice. So here I'm in my Nürnberg. I've got the armor piercing loaded, again 150mm armor piercing, and I've got an Omaha to shoot at. Now the Omaha is a light cruiser, very lightly armored, but she's bow in, and you see all but 2 of my shells actually managed to sail across her, and the 2 shells hit her in the superstructure. But now she's turning, and these shells will hit more reliably, and I can start hitting her in the side. And we see that most of these shells are doing full damage because she is a light cruiser and I can penetrate that light cruiser much more easily. But here comes a Congo. Now look where I'm hitting my shell, and my shells either do semi-pens or full pens when I hit her in the bow, but if I fire at the belt armor, it's only semi-bends and bounces. And that is the big difference. I have done much less armor with that last salvo than with this salvo, where every single shell penetrates, because the bow armor of the Congo is not as sturdy as the belt armor. So I can actually, well, in a normal scenario, I would have just torpedoed her. But that's not the point, right? So I can cause a lot more damage that way. Now, how about, can I hit the superstructure from here? If I aim a little bit higher, well, it's still mostly landed on the belt. So that's relatively difficult not to actually shoot over the ship. But we can do the same on the stern. So if we hit her in the stern, just behind the rear turret, it's a bit more difficult because the rear turret is quite far in the back on a Congo. Then we can do damage, and we can bounce some shells off the turrets, as we've just seen, while she's wildly turning. And we've got the bow to shoot at again. So we'll shoot into the bow, and we can do a very, very respectable amount of damage with 150mm armor piercing against battleships. This wouldn't have worked if we were further away. So here, again, we're in the Nuremberg, and we have a New York. And let's see where the shells land. And even on a relatively well-armored American battleship, if we manage to hit the stern of the ship, you see that? Full penetrations. If we were trying that anywhere in the midsection, we wouldn't be getting anything done. But with these shells, there are two of them bounced because they were going a bit higher, and again, they might have hit the turrets. But, or again, the random numbers didn't play ball, but we can get very respectable full penetrations in the stern of the ship. Now, how about something like a carrier, say, for example? Now, I will have to look up the armor scheme of, say, the Zuiho, but as we can see, we can do full penetrations in the bow. And let's try in the center. We can do full penetrations in the center. Let's try in the rear where the engines are, because you see that's where the smokestack is. And can we get anything done here? And we still get relatively reliable full penetrations. So this thing, and again I will have to look that up, may actually have relatively even armor all around, or well, no armor at all, because this is probably a converted freight ship or something of that sort. So if you are loading the armor piercing and you have to deal with an enemy ship like a battleship, it is extremely viable if you're close enough that you can aim reliably, to use the 150mm armor piercing to well, devastating effect. Because you are rapid firing, and your damage is going to rack up, especially on something like a German light cruiser, over time. There are, like I said, it depends on the gun type. Not all guns behave the same way. You can't say all 150mm armor piercing are going to behave like this. Some of them are going to behave vastly different. If you're shooting at a range where it's completely unlikely that you're going to hit the ship at all, then again, this is a completely different story. You better just aim at the center of mass and try to get as many shells on target as possible, or switch over to the high explosive and try to set some fires and do damage over time. Now, in something a little larger shells like the Admiral Hipper, which has 203mm main guns, again, you're going to have to see what you're shooting at and where you're going to hit it. Now here I'm shooting at a Wichita, which is bow in, but it is a cruiser. It's not a battleship. So and the Hipper has very hard-hitting armor-piercing shells. So I'm relatively certain that I can do a decent amount of damage wherever I'm hitting her. So these came in from top through the superstructure, but now I'm going to aim at the waterline. And you see as well here, I can do reliable penetrations. So here I will try to, as much as possible, if I'm against the target like this, hit her such that I can do citadels if I'm lucky, and actually get enough penetration through. I can also shoot her in the stern, if I can actually hit her. There we go. And again, I'm doing full penetrations, because the armor scheme is not really thick enough. Now how about a different target? How about a Japanese battleship? There's an Amagi here, and I'm at point blank range. And I'm getting semi-pens if I hit her in the main armor belt. So the Hipper's 200mm cannot really penetrate through the main armor belt. I'm getting semi-pens. I mean, they are very good, better than the Nürnberg's 150s, so they do get semi-pens reliably. But if I shoot at, say, the stern, I get one hit for 800. That is the difference if I am shooting at more lightly armored places on a battleship. So I will usually try to target her such that I manage to hit the front or the rear of the ship if I know that I cannot punch through the belt. And you see the amount of damage I'm doing to this Amagi over here compared to when I'm trying to shoot her at the waterline at the Citadel area. It's just a couple of semi-pens. So I'm doing almost twice the amount of damage just by hitting her outside the Citadel hitbox, because I know that I'm very unlikely to get a Citadel through anyway. So I'm much better off shooting at the places that I know that I can penetrate and do full damage with these armor-piercing shells. There we go. And yeah, that is the big difference between particular armor modules. And this can help you aim. So from here on, I'll be making a couple more videos about certain ship types, and this is going to be a series. And we'll be investigating their guns and their armor. Well, the armor is going to be a bit more difficult because then we're going to need to find one where I can actually shoot at it. Because I can't see it on myself, obviously. But I don't know where the shells are hitting. But we'll try to, get a bit of an idea and a feel for how the different guns operate against different targets, how the armor holds up against which guns coming in, and this should give you, well, really a bit more of a fine-grained detail if you want to maximize your output of damage. Now, don't worry about it that you're doing it wrong. Everybody learns. You can always just stick with the ground rules, which I've done in the ammo type videos, and say if you're shooting at a battleship and you've got 150 or 200 millimeter loaded, just switch over to the high explosive, because you're guaranteed to do damage. You're going to end up doing a lot less damage, but you're still going to do damage, and you might start a fire or two. So this is not necessarily always that clear cut. But if you really want to get into the advanced parts of where to aim and understanding the armor, understanding the impact of armor and how you can overcome it is kind of important. So I hope that cleared up a couple of things and was a useful part of information. And if you've got any more experience from your side, if you have any more information or any more evidence of how things are working, I'm always glad to hear that. Just keep in mind, I am certainly not the best player out here, and I'm sure others have figured out things that I still have to learn. But I hope it was interesting for you, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks. Bye.